Every year, over 600,000 visitors walk through the gates of Alnwick Castle to stand where Harry Potter learned to fly. Children pose with broomsticks. Parents photograph the towers. Nobody looks down. Beneath the courtyard where those broomstick lessons were filmed sits a dungeon with a single opening in its ceiling, a stone pit designed so that prisoners dropped inside could never climb out. The Percy family, who have owned this fortress for over 700 years, did not build it for magic. They built it to wage war on Scotland, overthrow kings, and execute anyone who stood between them and the most dangerous title in England, rulers of the North. Act 1. The Foundation. Chapter 1. The castle that eats its owners. Before the Percys, before the dungeons, before the blood, Alnwick Castle destroyed every family foolish enough to claim it. The story of Alnwick begins not with ambition, but with geography. The River Aln bends through the Northumberland lowlands like a slow fist, and at the point where the ground rises just enough to see trouble coming from the north, someone decided to build a wall. That someone was Ivo de Vesci, a Norman baron who understood a simple truth about England in 1096. The border with Scotland was not a line on a map. It was a wound that never closed. De Vesci chose his ground well. The castle sat on a natural mound above the river crossing, commanding the Great North Road, the main artery connecting England to Scotland. Any army marching south had to pass this spot. Any army marching north had to take it. From the day its first stones were laid, Alnwick existed for one reason: to bleed anyone who tried to cross. The Norman fortress was a motte and bailey structure, functional and brutal. A timber palisade surrounded the inner ward. Stone walls rose in layers over the following decades, each layer a response to a new threat. The site covered several acres, perched above a bend in the river that provided a natural moat on three sides. The fourth side, facing the town, was defended by a deep ditch and the sheer weight of stone that successive generations piled higher and thicker. Every improvement was a scar from a previous attack. The de Vesci family held the castle for 2 centuries, and those centuries were soaked in violence. In 1093, 3 years before the first Norman stones rose at Alnwick, King Malcolm III of Scotland rode south with an army to press his claim on Northumberland. He brought with him his eldest son, Edward, and a force large enough to terrify the northern English counties into submission. He was ambushed and killed near the castle at the Battle of Alnwick. His son Edward died of wounds suffered in the same fight. Their queen, Margaret, collapsed and died 3 days later upon hearing the news. 3 royal deaths in a single week, all connected to the ground beneath these walls. The shock rippled through both kingdoms. Scotland plunged into a succession crisis. The English north breathed a temporary sigh of relief, and Alnwick's reputation began to take shape in the stories told by soldiers and monks. This was not a place where invaders prospered. This was a place where they came to die. The pattern repeated. In 1174, William the Lion of Scotland besieged Alnwick during his invasion of northern England. He brought a substantial army and expected to sweep through Northumberland with ease. Instead, on a fog-shrouded morning, a force of English knights surprised him outside the castle walls. William was dragged from his horse and captured. The Scottish king was sent south in chains to face Henry II. The Treaty of Falaise that followed forced Scotland to acknowledge English overlordship. 2 Scottish kings had now met disaster at this fortress. The castle was earning a reputation that would cling to it for centuries. Alnwick did not just resist invaders, it consumed them. But the curse worked both ways. The Deveshy family, for all their military tenacity, could not hold what they had built. The pressures of border life eroded them from within. Maintaining a fortress of this size demanded constant revenue, and the Scottish raids that justified the castle's existence also destroyed the agricultural land that funded it. Eustace Deveshy was implicated in a plot against King John and fled to Scotland, where he was killed at the siege of Barnard Castle in 1216. His descendants limped on for another 80 years, their influence shrinking with each generation, their coffers emptying with each raid, until the male line ended entirely in 1297. The castle passed to Anthony Beck, the Prince Bishop of Durham, a man of immense ecclesiastical power who had no sons and no dynasty to sustain it. By 1309, Alnwick Castle was a fortress without a future. Its walls had withstood Scottish kings, but it had devoured two families from the inside. The Deveshys were gone. The bishop was aging. The most strategically important castle in northern England was effectively for sale, its stones waiting for a buyer foolish or fearless enough to inherit the violence that came with the deed. It needed a family willing to inherit not just the stones, but the bloodshed they attracted. It needed someone who looked at a ruin on the most dangerous border in Britain and saw not a liability, but a throne. It needed the Percys, and the Percys were already on their way. Chapter 2. A family that purchased a war. In 1309, Henry Percy did not buy a home. He bought a front line. Henry Percy, the first Baron Percy of Alnwick, was not a dreamer. He was a veteran of Edward I's brutal Scottish campaigns, a man who had ridden north with the hammer of the Scots and watched entire towns burn for the crime of being on the wrong side of an imaginary line. He had seen what border warfare looked like up close. He had buried men who fought beside him. He had calculated the odds that came with living in the north, and he had decided those odds suited him. When the chance came to buy Alnwick Castle from the Bishop of Durham, he did not hesitate. The price was a political calculation disguised as a property transaction. The castle was a machine, and Percy intended to operate it. What he acquired was formidable but incomplete. The Norman shell of the Devesy fortress still stood, but it was a relic of an earlier era of warfare, designed against raiding parties of a few hundred men, not the full-scale invasions that Edward's wars had unleashed. The Scottish armies that now swept south numbered in the thousands. They burned entire counties. They stayed for weeks, stripping the land of livestock, grain, and anything that could be carried or driven north. A castle built to resist a raid could not survive a siege. Percy began an immediate and total reconstruction. He tore down portions of the inner defenses and rebuilt the keep as a cluster of 7 semicircular towers arranged around an irregular courtyard. This was not decorative. Each tower could be defended independently. If attackers breached the outer wall, they faced not one gatehouse, but 7 separate strongpoints, each requiring its own siege. The design was radical for its time, turning the inner ward into a series of interlocking kill zones where every angle of approach was covered by at least 2 towers. The scale of what Percy built in those first years reveals the scale of what he feared. The curtain wall was thickened to withstand stone-throwing siege engines. The gatehouse was redesigned with a barbican, a protruding defense that forced attackers into a killing corridor before they could reach the gate itself. Arrow loops were cut at precise intervals along the walls, each one calculated to cover a specific field of fire. The entire perimeter was designed so that no attacker could approach any section of wall without being exposed to flanking fire from at least one tower. This was not a nobleman decorating his property. This was a military engineer fortifying a position he expected to be attacked within his own lifetime. He was right to expect it. In 1314, just 5 years after he purchased the castle, the Battle of Bannockburn shattered English power in Scotland. Robert the Bruce's forces routed the English army so completely that the political map of northern England changed overnight. Percy himself was captured in the fighting, and the ransom for his release would have been enormous, a crippling financial blow to a family that had just invested everything in a fortress. Robert the Bruce's forces raided deep into northern England in the years that followed, burning Northumberland with impunity. Villages within sight of Alnwick's towers went up in flames. The border that Percy had bought into was now the most dangerous stretch of land in Western Europe. Percy never saw his vision for Alnwick completed. He died in 1314, likely weakened by his captivity and the financial strain of ransom, leaving a half-finished fortress and a family that had staked everything on a bet that the border wars would make them indispensable to the English crown. It was a gamble that would define 7 centuries. The foundations he laid were both literal and dynastic. Every stone he set at Alnwick was a statement of intent. The Percys would hold the north, and the north would make them powerful. His son inherited not just the castle, but the obligation, the debt, and the dream. Whether that dream was worth its price, the dead at Bannockburn could not say. But the Percys were not asking the dead for permission. Chapter 3. Ransoms built these walls. The towers flanking Alnwick's entrance were paid for with the suffering of Scottish prisoners captured at the Battle of Neville's Cross. Henry Percy, the second Lord Percy of Alnwick, inherited his father's unfinished war and turned it into a business model. Where the first Lord had built with urgency and fear, the second built with calculation. He understood something that would define the Percy fortune for generations. Border warfare was not just a duty owed to the crown, it was a revenue stream, and a lucrative one. The second Lord Percy was a soldier from his first campaign. He fought at the naval battle of Sluys in 1340, part of the English fleet that annihilated the French navy in the opening years of the 100 Years' War. He served at the siege of Nantes. He campaigned under the Black Prince in France, riding through the devastation of the chevauchée, the scorched earth campaigns that Edward III used to break French resistance. These were not gentlemen's wars. They were grinding, in brutal affairs fought for territory, plunder, and ransom. The second Lord Percy learned his trade in the mud and blood of France, and he brought those lessons home to Northumberland. His greatest opportunity came not in France, but on his own doorstep. In 1346, King David II of Scotland invaded England, while Edward III was fighting in France, hoping to exploit the absence of the English army. It was a strategic gamble that made perfect sense on paper. England's best soldiers were across the Channel. The northern counties were defended by second-line troops and local levies. David expected an easy march south. He miscalculated catastrophically. At the Battle of Neville's Cross, near Durham, an English force commanded by northern barons destroyed the Scottish army. The fighting was savage. David himself was struck in the face by 2 arrows during the battle before being captured. Thousands of Scottish soldiers were taken prisoner, and the ransoms they generated flowed directly into the coffers of the men who had fought. Percy was among the victors. The ransom money from Neville's Cross funded the most visible transformation of Alnwick Castle, the construction of two massive octagonal towers flanking the main entrance. These towers, built around 1350, were not just defensive structures. They were declarations. Anyone approaching the castle passed between them, dwarfed by walls that rose over 60 feet and terminated in battlements bristling with stone figures of armed warriors. The message was unmistakable. This family fights. This family wins. And this family builds its monuments from the profits of that fighting. The scale of border warfare in this period defies casual understanding. Between 1300 and 1400, the Anglo-Scottish border saw an estimated 200 major raids, counter-raids, and military campaigns. The population of Northumberland, which had been roughly 40,000 before the Scottish Wars, may have declined by a third during the worst decades of violence. Entire villages were abandoned. Church records from the period list parish after parish as wasted, a bureaucratic term that meant the buildings were burned, the fields were untilled, and the people were dead or fled. Alnwick Castle sat at the center of this devastation, like a stone island in a sea of ruin. The Percy fortune grew in direct proportion to the misery surrounding it. Each tower, each battlement, each carved warrior standing guard on the skyline represented ransoms extracted, lands seized, and enemies broken. The Percy family crest, carved into the entrance towers, looked down on everyone who passed beneath. It was wealth literally extracted from human suffering and turned into architecture. The arms of a dynasty mortared into stone with the profits of captivity. By the end of the Second Lord's life, Alnwick had been transformed from a battered Norman shell into the most powerful private fortress in England. Its curtain wall enclosed an area of roughly 5 acres. The keep, with its 7 towers, dominated the skyline of the Aln Valley. The entrance towers announced to every visitor, friend, or enemy that the Percys had arrived and intended to stay. But the very power they had accumulated was about to become its own kind of danger. A family strong enough to defend the North was a family strong enough to threaten the crown. And the generation that followed would discover what happened when a border dynasty stopped looking north and started looking south toward London. The walls they had built with ransom money would soon need to withstand a different kind of siege, one waged not by a foreign king, but by their own. Act 2, The Hidden Reality. Chapter 4, The Kingmakers Who Forgot to Stop. The Percys helped put Henry IV on the throne. Then they decided they wanted it for themselves. The transformation of the Percy family from border warriors to political kingmakers happened with a speed that even they could not have anticipated. In 1399, England was governed by Richard II, a king whose erratic rule and aggressive seizure of noble estates had alienated much of the aristocracy. When Henry Bolingbroke, the Duke of Lancaster, returned from exile to reclaim his confiscated inheritance, the Percys saw an opportunity too large to ignore. Henry Percy, the first Earl of Northumberland, and his son, Henry Percy, known already as Harry Hotspur, threw their support behind Bolingbroke. Their reasons were partly principled and partly calculated. Richard had been unreliable. He had confiscated estates, banished nobles, and governed with a caprice that made long-term planning impossible for any family trying to maintain power in the north. Bolingbroke promised stability, predictability, and gratitude. But more than anything, the Percys understood that backing a successful usurper would make them the most powerful family in England outside the royal family itself. They were right. When Bolingbroke deposed Richard and crowned himself Henry IV, the rewards flowed immediately. The first Earl was confirmed as Constable of England. Hotspur was given command of the Welsh Marches. Percy allies were placed in positions of influence across the north. The family held the Scottish border, controlled the Welsh frontier, and had the new king's ear. For perhaps 18 months, they were the second most powerful family in the kingdom. Then the debts came due. Not metaphorical debts, literal ones. The Percys had raised armies, garrisoned castles, fed soldiers, and fought campaigns on the crown's behalf, and Henry IV had promised to reimburse them. The total owed reached approximately £20,000, an almost incomprehensible sum in an era when a skilled laborer earned 2 pence a day and a knight's annual income might reach £40. £20,000 represented the equivalent of decades of border warfare revenue, enough to build a castle from scratch, enough to fund an army for years. And the king simply did not pay. The money was only part of the grievance. Hotspur had captured several valuable Scottish prisoners at the Battle of Homildon Hill in 1402, including Archibald Douglas, the Earl of Douglas. This was a significant victory, a decisive defeat of a Scottish invasion force that had penetrated deep into Northumberland. The prisoners were worth a fortune in ransom. Ransoming captured nobles was the accepted practice. It was how border warfare paid for itself. But Henry IV ordered Hotspur to surrender the prisoners without ransom. The king claimed the right to decide the fate of captured nobles. Hotspur saw it as theft, pure and simple. The king was taking money out of the Percy family's pocket to fund his own treasury. Then came the matter of Edmund Mortimer. Mortimer was Hotspur's brother-in-law, captured by the Welsh rebel Owain Glyndwr during the Welsh Revolt. The Percys expected the king to ransom Mortimer, as custom demanded for a nobleman held captive. Henry refused. The reason was nakedly political. Mortimer had a legitimate claim to the English throne through descent from Lionel of Antwerp, the second son of Edward III. If the throne belonged to the heir of Lionel rather than the heir of John of Gaunt, then Mortimer was the rightful king and Henry was a usurper. Henry had no interest in freeing a potential rival. By 1403, the Percys had reached a conclusion that would have seemed insane even 2 years earlier. The king they had created was a liability. He owed them a fortune. He had stolen their prisoners. He had abandoned their kinsmen, and his claim to the throne was, in their eyes, no stronger than the claim of the man rotting in a Welsh dungeon. The alliance that formed was extraordinary in its ambition. The Percys, Owain Glyndwr, and Edmund Mortimer agreed to a plan that would have redrawn the map of Britain entirely. Under the so-called tripartite indenture, England and Wales would be carved into 3 kingdoms. Glyndwr would rule an expanded Wales, stretching east to the Severn and north to the Mersey. Mortimer would take southern England, and the Percys would claim the north, from the River Trent to the Scottish border, as their own sovereign territory. It was audacious, it was treasonous, and it was, in its own brutal logic, entirely consistent with what the Percys had been building toward for a century. They had not purchased Alnwick Castle merely to guard a border on behalf of a distant king. They had purchased it to rule one. The distinction between guardian and king had never been as clear as the crown pretended, and now the Percys were done pretending. The tripartite indenture was more than a military pact. It was a constitutional vision, a complete reimagining of what the British Isles could look like if the existing order were swept away. The three conspirators drew borders, assigned territories, and divided the spoils of a kingdom that they had not yet conquered. It was planning on a scale that required either supreme confidence or complete detachment from reality. The Percys had both. Hotspur, the man who would lead the rebellion in the field, was by this point the most famous soldier in England. He had earned his nickname through decades of border warfare, fighting with a ferocity and speed that contemporaries found astonishing. He had fought at Otterburn in 1388, been captured and ransomed, fought again at Homildon Hill, and distinguished himself in every campaign the Crown had asked him to join. He was a man who understood war in his bones. What he did not understand was politics. The political dimension of the rebellion required patience, coordination, and secrecy. Hotspur had none of these qualities. He moved too fast, trusted too much, and believed that the same courage that won battles could win a kingdom. He was about to discover the difference. But ambition is not a plan, and the plan depended on one thing the Percys could not guarantee: that every piece would arrive on the battlefield at the same time. They were about to discover what happens when even one piece is missing. Chapter 5. An arrow through the visor. On the 21st of July, 1403, Harry Hotspur opened his visor at Shrewsbury, and a single arrow ended the Percy dream of kingship. The road to Shrewsbury was paved with miscalculation. Hotspur had marched south from Chester with roughly 10,000 men, intending to join forces with Owain Glyndwr's Welsh army before confronting the king. The plan required speed and coordination, yet two things that medieval warfare delivered unreliably at best. Hotspur had the speed. He did not have the coordination. Glyndwr's forces were still in Wales, delayed by terrain, weather, or the simple logistics of moving a medieval army through hostile country without modern roads or communication. The Earl of Northumberland, Hotspur's father, was still raising troops in the north, assembling the second arm of the rebellion that was supposed to crush the king between two forces. Hotspur, impetuous by nature and now committed beyond the point of retreat, decided to fight without either of them. It was the decision of a man who had never learned to wait, and it would destroy everything his family had spent a century building. King Henry IV moved with a speed that caught the rebels off guard. He force-marched his army to Shrewsbury and arrived before Hotspur could link up with any of his allies. On the morning of the 21st of July, the two armies faced each other across a field of peas north of the town. Perhaps 16,000 to 20,000 soldiers stood in the July heat, English banners on both sides, divided between two armies about to do something that had never been done before on English soil. The Battle of Shrewsbury was the first major engagement in which English longbowmen fought against English longbowmen. The weapon that had devastated French knights at Crécy and would devastate them again at Agincourt was now turned inward. The opening volleys were catastrophic on a scale that neither side had anticipated. Arrows flew at a rate of roughly 12 per minute per archer, and with several thousand archers on each side, the air above that field of peas became a continuous curtain of ash and steel. Contemporary accounts describe arrows falling so thick they blotted out the afternoon sun. Men died standing up, pinned through by shafts that punched through armor at ranges of less than 100 yards. The Prince of Wales, the future Henry V, was struck in the face by an arrow that embedded itself 6 inches into his skull. He survived, barely. The royal surgeon John Bradmore invented a specialized extraction tool to remove the arrowhead, a procedure that took days and that the prince endured without any effective anesthesia. He would carry the scar for the rest of his life. The casualties were staggering by any standard. The estimates range from 1,600 to 5,000 dead on both sides in a battle that lasted approximately 3 hours. The fields around Shrewsbury were so thick with corpses that mass graves were dug for weeks afterward. The Church of St. Mary Magdalene, which still stands near the battlefield, was said to have been surrounded by the dead, the burial ground overflowing into the lanes. Hotspur saw the battle turning against him and made the decision that would seal his legend. He launched a direct cavalry charge at the king's position, hoping to kill Henry IV in personal combat and end the battle in a single stroke. If the king died, the rebellion succeeded. If the king lived, everything was lost. There was no middle ground. It was either the bravest or the most reckless act of the entire medieval period. A single knight, so riding directly at the King of England through a storm of arrows fired by his own countrymen, with no guarantee that anyone would follow him and no way to turn back. He almost succeeded. Hotspur's charge cut deep into the royal position. Henry's standard-bearer was killed. Knights disguised as the king, decoys placed in royal armor to confuse exactly this kind of attack, were struck down one after another. For minutes, that must have felt like hours. The battle hung in the balance. If Hotspur reached the real king, history would have changed. Then Hotspur raised his visor. The accounts vary on why. Heat exhaustion was common in armored combat, where temperatures inside a full suit of plate could reach dangerous levels within minutes of exertion. Perhaps he needed air. Perhaps he needed to see the field clearly. Perhaps it was simply reflex. Whatever the reason, in that single exposed moment, an arrow struck him in the face. He fell from his horse. His men, seeing their leader fall, broke and ran. The battle was over. What happened next was designed to ensure that no Percy would ever attempt rebellion again. Henry IV ordered Hotspur's body buried at Whitchurch, 20 miles from the battlefield. When rumors spread that Hotspur had survived, that he was hiding in the hills, that the rebellion was not over, the king ordered the body exhumed. It was brought to Shrewsbury and impaled on a spear, propped upright between two millstones in the town marketplace, so the people could see with their own eyes that Harry Hotspur was dead. Then, on the king's orders, the body was quartered. The 4 pieces were sent to London, Chester, Bristol, Leeds, and Newcastle. Hotspur's head was cut from his body and spiked on the gates of York, facing north toward the lands he had tried to claim as a kingdom. It stayed there until it rotted. The message was absolute. The Percys had gambled on a crown and lost. The price was not just a life, but a public desecration designed to humiliate a dynasty across the length of England. A man who had been the most celebrated warrior in the kingdom was now decaying in 5 separate locations, a warning nailed to the gates of the realm. Shakespeare would later immortalize Hotspur as the embodiment of reckless courage, a romantic figure whose passion outstripped his judgment. Prince Hal, the future Henry V, would be defined in Shakespeare's imagination by his rivalry with Hotspur, the dissolute prince measuring himself against the brilliant rebel. 4 centuries of English literature would be shaped by the events of a single afternoon in Shropshire. But in July of 1403, there was nothing romantic about it. The battlefield was a slaughterhouse. The men who survived described sounds that stayed with them for years: the hiss of arrows in flight, the crack of steel on bone, the screaming of wounded horses trapped beneath their riders. A dream of northern kingship had ended with a man's face torn open by an arrow, his body butchered and displayed like meat in a market, and his family staring at the wreckage of everything they had spent a century building. The battle's consequences rippled far beyond the Percy family. It established the Lancastrian dynasty on the throne for a generation. It proved that the English longbow was as devastating in civil war as in foreign campaigns. It created a template for the succession crises that would eventually ignite the Wars of the Roses. And it branded the Percy name with treason, a mark that would take decades to remove and that would never fully fade. Alnwick Castle still stood, but the family that had built it was about to discover what happened when the crown decided to take it back. Chapter 6. The castle surrendered without a fight. After Hotspur's death, Alnwick Castle did something it had never done before. It gave up. In the weeks following Shrewsbury, the Earl of Northumberland attempted the impossible: to salvage a rebellion that had already cost him his son and his honor. He had not arrived in time for the battle. Some historians suggest he deliberately held back, waiting to see which side would win before committing his forces, a strategy of calculated cowardice that was entirely rational and entirely damning. Others argue that his march south was genuinely delayed by the logistics of assembling a northern army in midsummer. Whatever the truth, his absence at Shrewsbury saved his life and destroyed his credibility. Henry IV initially showed restraint. The Earl was stripped of some offices but allowed to keep his title and, crucially, Alnwick Castle. The king understood that the north still needed its wardens. The Scottish border did not stop being dangerous because the Percys had rebelled. Raids continued. Armies assembled. The infrastructure of northern defense depended on the Percy network of castles, garrisons, and military tenants. Replacing them was not a simple matter. It was a calculation, not mercy, that kept the Earl alive. The Earl mistook it for weakness. In 1405, he joined a second rebellion, this time allying with Richard Scrope, the Archbishop of York, and Thomas Mowbray, the Earl Marshal. The plot was poorly organized, hastily assembled, and collapsed before it reached the battlefield. Scrope and Mowbray were captured and executed. The execution of an archbishop shocked England because it was considered sacrilege of the highest order. The Earl fled to Scotland, then to Wales, spending 3 years as a fugitive, moving between the enemies of the English crown. It was during this period that Alnwick Castle surrendered for the first time in its history. Faced with the threat of royal bombardment and without its lord, the garrison capitulated. The fortress that had withstood Scottish kings survived 2 centuries of border raids and been rebuilt by men who would rather die than submit simply opened its gates. The walls had not been breached. The towers had not been broken. The stone warriors still stood on the battlements, but without a Percy to command them, the defenders had nothing to fight for. The stones were the same. The walls were the same. But without a Percy inside them, the castle had no purpose and no will. The Earl of Northumberland was formally attainted in 1406, meaning his lands and titles were legally stripped by Act of Parliament. Every acre, every manor, every stone of every castle the Percys had spent a century acquiring was confiscated by the crown. The name Percy, which had commanded armies and shaped the politics of northern England for generations, was declared traitorous. In 1408, the Earl made one final attempt to reclaim his position. He raised an army in the north, drawing on the loyalty of tenants and allies who still remembered what the Percy name meant on the border. At the Battle of Bramham Moor in Yorkshire, he met royal forces and was killed. His body was quartered, just as his son's had been 5 years earlier. His head was sent to London Bridge. Two Percys, father and son, had now been dismembered and displayed across England within 5 years of each other. The dynasty appeared to have authored its own extinction in the most violent way possible. Alnwick and all Percy lands were confiscated. The castle sat in royal hands, garrisoned by the king's men, the Percy crest still carved into stones that no Percy was allowed to enter. But the Percy story refused to follow a straight line toward extinction. The attainder was eventually reversed. The second Earl's grandson was restored to the title and lands, partly because the crown needed wardens of the north, and partly because the tangled politics of the 15th century rewarded patience. The restored Percys walked back into Alnwick as if they had never left. Then came the Wars of the Roses, and the castle entered its most chaotic period. Between 1461 and 1464, Alnwick was besieged 3 separate times. It changed hands between Lancastrian and Yorkist forces, like a prize in a blood-soaked game of chess, each side capturing and losing the fortress within months. The first siege, in 1462, that saw a Yorkist army surround the castle. The Lancastrian garrison held out for weeks before negotiating a surrender. Within months, Lancastrian forces with French and Scottish support retook it. The pattern repeated with nauseating regularity. Alnwick was captured, lost, captured again, its walls scarred by cannonballs, its garrison rotating between armies that arrived with different banners but identical demands. During one siege, the Lancastrian garrison, facing certain surrender, made a decision that captured the Percy spirit in a single act. They dumped their cannonballs down the castle well, rather than let the Yorkist forces use them against other Lancastrian castles. It was militarily pointless. The well held no strategic value. The cannonballs, submerged in water, would never fire again. But the act was not about strategy. It was about refusing to be useful to the enemy, about spitting in the face of defeat, even when defeat was certain. The well, still visible today, sits in the inner courtyard. Those cannonballs remained at the bottom for centuries, corroding slowly in the dark water, a monument to defiance so stubborn it chose destruction over defeat. During another siege, the defenders escaped through the sally port in the postern tower, slipping out under cover of darkness while the besieging army waited at the main gates. They walked through a concealed door, crossed the ditch, and vanished into the Northumberland night. The castle surrendered the next morning, empty. The Yorkists had won the walls, but not the men inside them. It was a final insult from a garrison that would rather disappear than submit. By the end of the Wars of the Roses, the Percy family had lost Alnwick, regained it, lost it again, and watched it endure more violence in 3 years than most castles experienced in a century. Their lands had been confiscated, their name had been declared traitorous. Their future, by any rational assessment, was extinct, and yet, against every reasonable expectation, they were about to survive again. Act 3, The Collapse and Transformation. Chapter 7, The Bloodline That Refused to Die. The Percy name should have ended 3 separate times. Each time, someone found a legal loophole, a strategic marriage, or a convenient act of parliament. Survival for the Percys was never about luck. It was about a ruthless instinct for knowing when to bend, when to break, and when to become someone else entirely. The The family that had tried to carve England into 3 kingdoms learned that through generations of pain, that the surest path to power was not rebellion, it was adaptation. The 4th Earl of Northumberland demonstrated this instinct at its most coldly effective. At the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, the decisive clash that ended the Wars of the Roses, the 4th Earl commanded a substantial force. He stood on the field with thousands of armed men, positioned where he could intervene decisively for either side. Richard III expected Percy's support. He had reason to expect it. The Percys had been Yorkist allies, restored to their titles by Yorkist kings. Richard looked to the Percy banners and saw reinforcements. He did not receive them. The 4th Earl kept his men stationary throughout the battle, watching as Richard charged into Henry Tudor's lines and was killed. It was not cowardice. It was calculation of the most cold-blooded kind. The Percys had spent the previous century picking sides and paying for it in blood and attainder. The 4th Earl chose to pick no side at all, and when the dust settled, he presented himself to the new Tudor king as a loyal subject who had simply declined to fight for a tyrant. It worked, but it cost him everything except his life. The people of Northumberland, who depended on the Percys for protection and leadership, saw the 4th Earl's inaction at Bosworth as betrayal. The tenants who had fought and died for Percy lords in every generation saw a lord who refused to fight for anyone. In 1489, during a tax revolt in Yorkshire, a mob dragged the 4th Earl from his horse and murdered him. The family that had survived rebellion, attainder, and dismemberment was nearly undone by the contempt of its own people. The Tudor era transformed the meaning of castles entirely. Henry VII and Henry VIII consolidated royal power so effectively that the great northern fortresses ceased to be instruments of independent military action. The days when a single family could raise an army, defy a king, and carve a kingdom from the map were over. The Percys adapted because they had no choice. They became courtiers, administrators, and political operators. The 6th Earl was so entangled in Tudor politics that he served on the jury that condemned Anne Boleyn in 1536, was rumored to have been one of her suitors before her marriage to the king, and died at Alnwick in 1537, under circumstances that suggested either illness or despair. His will distributed his vast estates to the crown rather than to his brother, a final act that was either piety or spite. The 7th Earl was executed in 1572 for his role in the Rising of the North, a Catholic rebellion against Elizabeth I that briefly threatened to restore Catholicism and place Mary Queen of Scots on the English throne. Even in an era of relative peace, the Percys could not resist the gravitational pull of treason. It was in their blood the way the border was in their stone. The English Civil War brought one more test. Algernon Percy, the 10th Earl, navigated the 1640s with a caution that would have astonished his medieval ancestors. He served Parliament during the war, but avoided the extremism of the regicides. He held positions of authority without committing to any faction completely. He survived the Commonwealth, survived the Restoration, and died in 1668 with his estates and his head both intact. It was perhaps the least dramatic chapter in Percy history, and for exactly that reason, it was the one that ensured the dynasty continued. Then the bloodline itself failed. The male line of the Percy family died out. The great surname, carried through rebellions and executions and centuries of warfare, had no male heir to carry it forward. Elizabeth Percy, the heiress, married Charles Seymour, the Duke of Somerset, bringing the Percy estates into the Seymour family. Their grandson, Hugh Smithson, a baronet from Yorkshire with ambition that matched any medieval Percy, he married into the line and petitioned Parliament to adopt the Percy name and arms. In 1750, an Act of Parliament transformed Hugh Smithson into Hugh Percy, the first Duke of Northumberland. It was the most Percy move imaginable. When the bloodline could not sustain the name, they found someone willing to buy into the legend. Smithson had no Percy blood in his veins. He had something better. He had money, political connections, and the understanding that a name like Percy was not a biological inheritance. It was a brand, and brands could be acquired. The new Duke poured resources into Alnwick, hiring Robert Adam to redesign portions of the interior in the fashionable Gothic revival style. For the first time in centuries, the castle was being renovated, not for war, but for status. The medieval fortress was being domesticated, its sharp edges smoothed, its violence draped in tapestries and reupholstered in velvet. But the most dramatic reinvention was still a century away, and it would transform the castle so completely that even the men who built it would not have recognized what it became. Chapter 8: The Italian Disguise. In the 1850s, the 4th Duke of Northumberland gutted the medieval interior and replaced it with something no Percy warrior would have recognized. Algernon Percy, the 4th Duke, was a man caught between two impulses: reverence for the past and impatience with its limitations. He had inherited a castle that was, by the mid-19th century, a patchwork of medieval stonework, 18th century Gothic revival updates by Robert Adam, and the accumulated compromises of generations who had been too busy surviving to think about aesthetics. The exterior still proclaimed the Middle Ages, with its towers and battlements and stone warriors standing guard against an enemy that had not existed for 400 years. The interior was a different story, dark, cramped, and drafty, a reminder that the building had been designed to withstand siege, not to host the kind of gatherings that a Victorian duke was expected to provide. The 4th Duke decided to resolve this contradiction by erasing it. He commissioned the Italian architect Luigi Canina to plan a complete transformation of the castle's interior. When Canina died in 1856, the work continued under Anthony Salvin, who handled the structural and exterior restorations, and Giovanni Montiroli, who completed the Italian interiors. The result was one of the most ambitious and controversial renovations in English architectural history. The medieval halls were gutted, centuries of accumulated interior fabric, the layers of plaster, timber, and stone that bore the marks of every generation since the 1300s, were stripped away. The Robert Adam interiors from the 1700s, which had themselves replaced earlier medieval rooms, were torn out in their turn. In their place rose rooms that belonged not to Northumberland, but to Renaissance Italy. The state rooms were lined with carved and gilded Italian woodwork. Ceilings were painted with elaborate frescoes depicting classical scenes. Floors were laid with inlaid marble in geometric patterns that required months of precision work. The library received carved bookcases that stretched from floor to ceiling, each one a work of Italian craftsmanship, transported to a castle that sat less than 40 miles from the Scottish border. A grand staircase in pale stone replaced the narrow spiral stairs that had served defenders for 5 centuries. The Prudo Tower, named for one of the family's ancillary castles, was fitted with paintings by Canaletto and Titian. The sheer scale of materials tells the story. Marble was shipped from Italy by the ton. Gilded wood panels were carved in Italian workshops, crated, transported across the Alps, loaded onto ships, sailed to English ports, and carted up the Great North Road to Northumberland. The fourth Duke's renovation required more international logistics than some military campaigns. Iron, glass, carved stone, impigments for the fresco painters, gold leaf for the gilders, exotic woods for the marquetry workers. Each room consumed resources that had to be sourced from across Europe and assembled in a castle that still lacked reliable plumbing. The cost was staggering. The fourth Duke spent an estimated £320,000 on the renovation, a sum equivalent to tens of millions in modern currency. He hired roughly 100 Italian craftsmen and brought them to Northumberland to execute the work. Specialists in marquetry, gilding, fresco painting, mosaic, and stone carving. They lived in the castle town for years, transforming room after room while the North Sea wind howled across the Northumberland moors and rattled the medieval windows above their heads. The incongruity was stunning. Outside, and sheep grazed on hills that had seen Scottish raids within living memory. Inside, you might have been standing in a palazzo on the Arno. The architectural press of the day was divided. Some praised the fourth Duke for saving a crumbling medieval relic and transforming it into a home fit for one of England's premier aristocratic families. Others saw it as vandalism of the worst kind, the destruction of authentic medieval fabric in favor of fashionable but historically inappropriate decoration. The debate touched on a question that would define heritage conservation for the next century and a half. When you replace every interior surface of a historic building, is it still the same building? Is it preservation or erasure? And who has the right to decide? The fourth Duke would have had no patience for the question. And he was not a preservationist. He was a Percy, or at least he bore the name. And the Percys had always done whatever was necessary to make the castle serve the needs of the present, whether that meant building towers with ransom money or replacing guard rooms with drawing rooms lined in Italian silk. What he created was a building that existed in 2 centuries simultaneously. Walk through the outer gate, past the barbican, beneath the stone warriors on the battlements, and you are in the 1300s. Step inside, and you are in the 1850s, surrounded by marble, gilt, and the quiet hum of Victorian confidence that the present was always an improvement on the past. The philosophical tension is still visible today. Visitors who come expecting a medieval fortress discover rooms designed to impress a very different kind of guest. The oubliette sits beneath the same structure that houses Canaletto paintings. The murder holes in the gatehouse look down on a courtyard that leads to a state dining room set for 40. Alnwick Castle is not a museum of any single period. It is an argument in stone and marble that survival means constant reinvention, even when that reinvention means destroying what came before. The fourth Duke completed his renovation and died in 1865. He left behind a castle that was more comfortable, more beautiful, and more confused about its own identity than at any point in its 700-year history. The century that followed would test whether beauty was enough to save it. Chapter 9. The century that nearly won. Your 2 world wars, crippling taxation, and the end of aristocratic England should have finished Alnwick for good. The 20th century arrived at Alnwick Castle like a siege engine of a kind no medieval builder could have imagined. The enemy was not a Scottish army or a rival dynasty. It was time itself, compounded by taxation, social upheaval, and the slow collapse of the economic system that had sustained great English estates for half a millennium. For 600 years, the Percys had fought off everything the world threw at them. The 20th century asked a question none of them had faced before. What if the world simply stops caring? The first blow fell in 1914. The Great War consumed a generation of young men drawn from the villages and tenant farms that had sustained the Percy economy for centuries. Northumberland sent thousands to the Western Front. They marched away from stone cottages within sight of the castle and died in the mud of Flanders and the Somme. The casualty lists arrived week after week. Communities that had supplied soldiers to Percy lords since the feudal era lost their sons, their fathers, their futures. The social contract that had bound landlord to tenant, castle to village, nobility to community, began to tear. The second blow was financial. The introduction of death duties, inheritance taxes levied on great estates, began eroding aristocratic wealth from 1894 onward. The principle was simple and devastating. Each time a great landholder died, the government took a percentage of the estate's value. For families whose wealth was tied to land, into fields and forests and buildings rather than bank accounts and stock portfolios, these taxes were existential. You could not sell a wing of your castle to pay the bill. You could not liquidate a generation of history. Each generational transfer stripped more capital from families that had held their estates for centuries. The great country houses of England began to fall. Between 1945 and 1975, an estimated 1,050 country houses were demolished across Britain. Families that had occupied their seats since the Tudors or the Stuarts found themselves unable to pay the tax bill when a duke or earl died, and the only options were to sell the house, demolish it, or hand it to the National Trust and become tenants in their own ancestral homes. Alnwick survived, but survival was not comfortable. Because during the Second World War, the castle served as a temporary home for evacuee schoolchildren from Newcastle. Their lessons echoed through the same state rooms that the fourth Duke had lined with Italian marble. Small hands touched surfaces that had been crafted by Florentine artisans for the entertainment of aristocratic guests. Parts of the castle were requisitioned for military use. The grounds, once maintained by armies of gardeners, grew wild. The infrastructure of a medieval fortress, overlaid with Victorian luxury, required constant investment, and the money was running out. The 8th Duke of Northumberland managed to hold the estate together through the interwar period, but the post-war years brought tax rates that would have seemed confiscatory to any previous generation. At one point, the top marginal rate of income tax in Britain reached 97.5%. Death duties could claim up to 80% of an estate's value. The mathematics were brutal and inescapable. Every generation that died left the next one poorer, and the castle demanded more money every year simply to keep the roof from collapsing, the walls from crumbling, and the Italian interiors from succumbing to damp and neglect. The 10th Duke, Hugh Percy, inherited the title in 1940 and managed the estates for 48 years, the longest tenure in the family's modern history. His life's work was not conquest or rebellion or artistic transformation. It was maintenance. He sold peripheral properties to raise capital. He opened portions of the castle to paying visitors. He negotiated with tax authorities, pleaded with heritage bodies, and managed a portfolio of agricultural land, forest, and property that generated just enough revenue to keep the castle from falling into irreversible decay. Consider what the 10th Duke faced in raw numbers. The Alnwick estate covered roughly 100,000 acres across Northumberland. The castle itself contained roughly 150 rooms. The roof alone, a vast expanse of lead sheeting over medieval timber, required inspection and repair on a cycle that never ended. The heating bill for a stone building with walls 6 feet thick in a county that routinely saw winter temperatures below freezing for months at a time was staggering. The staff required to maintain the gardens, the archives, the art collection, the structural fabric, the electrical systems, the plumbing, and the basic habitability of a 700-year-old building numbered in the dozens. Each of these people needed to be paid. Each of these systems needed to be funded, and the revenue from a handful of tourists who visited during the summer months covered only a fraction of the cost. He made the compromises that survival demanded, trading privacy for revenue and tradition for pragmatism. Parts of the castle were used by other institutions. Rooms that had once hosted aristocratic gatherings became spaces for public events. The intimate relationship between a family and its ancestral home was diluted, bit by the financial necessity of sharing it with strangers. It was unglamorous work, invisible to history, and it saved the castle. By the 1990s, Alnwick Castle was still standing, still in Percy hands, but its future was genuinely uncertain. The tourist revenue was modest compared to properties like Chatsworth or Blenheim that had invested heavily in visitor facilities. The maintenance costs were immense and growing. The fabric of the building, 700 years of stone, timber, lead, and glass, required investment on a scale that no single family could reasonably sustain without some extraordinary stroke of fortune. The castle needed something unprecedented, a rescue from a source that no Percy ancestor could have predicted, and that the warriors who built those walls would never have understood. It needed a wizard. Act 4, Resolution and Legacy. Chapter 10, The Boy Who Saved Them. In 2000, a film crew arrived at Alnwick looking for a castle that could pass as a school of witchcraft. And the Percys made the most Percy decision imaginable. They let someone else's story pay the bills. The selection of Alnwick Castle as a filming location for the first Harry Potter film was not inevitable. The production team scouted dozens of castles across England and Scotland. They needed a building that looked sufficiently ancient and imposing to serve as the exterior of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. The castle had to feel both welcoming and dangerous, a place where children would want to study and where dark things might lurk in the corridors. Alnwick's combination of genuine medieval walls, dramatic towers, expansive grounds, and accessible location made it a natural choice. Gloucester Cathedral provided the cloisters. Christ Church at Oxford supplied the dining hall. But Alnwick gave them the exterior, the iconic silhouette that would become synonymous with magic. The real decision, however, was not the filmmakers. It was the Percys. Allowing a Hollywood production to use a 700-year-old fortress as a film set could have gone badly. Crews bring heavy equipment, generators, artificial lighting rigs, hundreds of crew members, and crowds of onlookers. They rearrange spaces, hang cables from medieval stonework, and impose schedules that have nothing to do with the dignity most aristocratic families associate with their ancestral homes. The Percys said yes without visible hesitation. They had been making uncomfortable decisions in the interest of survival for 7 centuries. This was simply the latest. The first 2 Harry Potter films, released in 2001 and 2002, were shot partially at Alnwick, The castle's outer bailey served as the location where first-year students learned to ride broomsticks. The courtyard, the same courtyard beneath which prisoners had once been dropped into the oubliette, became the place where children lined up for their first flying lesson. The image of young actors hovering on broomsticks against the backdrop of medieval towers became one of the most recognizable scenes in modern cinema. The impact on Alnwick was transformative on a scale that dwarfed anything the Fourth Duke's renovation had achieved. Before the films, the castle attracted a respectable but modest number of visitors. Afterward, the numbers exploded. Annual visitor figures rose to over 600,000. The castle became one of the most visited heritage sites in England, rivaling properties with centuries more investment in tourism, infrastructure, and marketing. Jane Percy, the Duchess of Northumberland, saw the opportunity and seized it with a boldness that her medieval predecessors would have recognized. She initiated the creation of the Alnwick Garden, a 12-acre contemporary garden designed not as a nostalgic recreation of historical horticulture, but as a modern attraction in its own right. The project cost approximately £42 million and included a grand cascade, one of the largest water features in the United Kingdom, a treehouse restaurant built among a canopy of lime trees, and, most controversially, a poison garden containing over 100 species of plants that can kill, intoxicate, or cause severe harm. The scale contrast is almost comical. 600,000 visitors per year now walk through grounds where, 6 centuries ago, armies clashed and prisoners vanished into stone pits. Children buy wands in the gift shop. Parents take photographs in the courtyard. The castle's revenue depends on the continued association with a fictional wizard, and the Percys, who spent centuries building a fortune on real warfare, have adapted seamlessly to an economy built on imaginary magic. It is, in its own way, the most Percy thing they have ever done. The family has always understood that power comes from controlling whatever the current era values most. In the 1300s, that was military force. In the 1850s, it was cultural prestige. In the 21st century, it is a boy with a lightning bolt scar and a broomstick. But beneath the broomsticks, the old castle is still there, and it has stories that no film crew ever captured. Chapter 11. The Dungeon Beneath the Broomsticks. The oubliette still sits beneath the castle, a stone throat designed to swallow a human being whole, and no tour guide mentions it. Walk through the main entrance of Alnwick Castle today, and you pass beneath the same barbican that Henry Percy built in the early 1300s. The stone warriors on the battlements, some original medieval figures, and some 18th century replacements carved by craftsmen hired by the first Duke, still look north toward Scotland. The arrow loops are still cut into the walls at precisely calculated intervals. The murder holes, openings in the ceiling through which boiling liquid or stones could be dropped on attackers trapped in the entry passage, are still visible above your head if you think to look up. Most visitors do not look up. They look ahead, toward the courtyard, toward the gift shop, toward the broomstick experience. The ground floor of the Gatehouse Towers contains 2 rooms. One is a guard chamber, a vaulted stone room where the garrison would have mustered during an alert, checking weapons and awaiting orders. The other is a dungeon. It is not prominently marked on tourist routes. It sits quietly behind stone walls that have not changed in 700 years, waiting for no one, remembering everyone. Below the dungeon, accessible through a grate in the floor, is the oubliette. The word comes from the French oublier, to forget. It is a pit, roughly 10 feet deep, with smooth stone walls and no door. Prisoners were dropped through the grate and left. The opening above was too high to reach. The walls offered no handholds. A human being placed in this space could stand, sit, or lie down. They could not climb. They could not escape. They could shout, and the sound would travel up through the stone throat to the floor above, where guards would hear it and do nothing. The entire design had a single purpose: to make a person disappear while still alive. This pit sits directly beneath the courtyard where Harry Potter's broomstick lessons were filmed. The juxtaposition is not metaphorical, it is architectural. The same square footage of ground that millions of tourists associate with childhood wonder and cinematic magic is the ceiling of a room designed to erase a human being from existence. The children posing with broomsticks are standing, literally, on top of a medieval mechanism for slow, forgotten death. Walk deeper into the castle and the contrasts multiply. The well in the inner courtyard, the one where Lancastrian defenders dumped their cannonballs rather than surrender them during the Wars of the Roses, is visible but unremarkable to most visitors. It looks like a decorative feature, something to photograph. It is, in fact, a monument to defiance so absolute that men chose to destroy their own weapons rather than allow an enemy to use them. Those cannonballs sat at the bottom of that well for centuries, slowly corroding in the dark water, the last act of a garrison that refused to be useful to its conquerors. The postern tower, through which the garrison escaped during the Yorkist siege, still stands at the rear of the castle. Its sally port, a small concealed door designed to be invisible from outside, is still there. The tower that allowed men to slip away from a besieging army in the darkness of a 15th century night is now passed by visitors on their way to the cafe. The strategic escape route is a shortcut to scones. The stone figures on the battlements, the ones that tourists photograph from the gardens below, were placed there for a specific tactical purpose. From a distance, an approaching enemy could not tell the difference between a stone figure and a living sentry. The battlement warriors made the garrison appear larger than it was, a medieval deception that served the same purpose as inflatable tanks in the Second World War. Some of those figures are originals from the 1300s, their features eroded by 7 centuries of Northumberland weather. Others are replacements, carved in the 1750s and 1760s by the first Duke's craftsmen. The old warriors and the new stand side by side, indistinguishable from below, guarding a gift shop. There is no part of Alnwick Castle that is only what it appears to be. Every wall has a second purpose. Every room has a previous life. The beauty of the Italian staterooms exists in the same structure as the brutality of the oubliette, and the distance between them is measured not in centuries, but in floors. The same roof covers both. The real story of Alnwick Castle is not written in any guidebook. It is written in the stone itself, in the layers of construction and destruction and reconstruction that span 700 years of a single family's refusal to disappear. It is a story more compelling than any spell, more dramatic than any film, and more durable than any magic, and it is still being written. Chapter 12. 700 years of refusing to fall. The Percys are still there. After every rebellion, every execution, every century that should have ended them, the family is still inside the walls. Ralph Percy, the 12th Duke of Northumberland, lives at Alnwick Castle today. He walks through the same gatehouse that his ancestors built with Scottish ransom money. He passes beneath the same barbican where murder holes once dripped with whatever the defenders could heat and pour. He lives in rooms decorated with Italian marble paid for by a Victorian duke who would have been horrified by the concept of a gift shop, surrounded by walls raised by a medieval lord who would have been horrified by the concept of peace. The family has held these walls since 1309, 717 years. 31 monarchs have sat on the English throne in that time. England has fought wars with Scotland, France, Spain, the Netherlands, Germany, and itself. The feudal system has risen and collapsed. The British Empire has been built and dismantled. 2 world wars have reshaped the entire globe. The horse has given way to the car, the sword to the missile, the ransom to the tax return. And through every convulsion, every transformation, every apocalypse, large and small, the Percys have remained at Alnwick. The survival is not accidental. It is the product of a specific, repeating strategy that every generation has executed, consciously or instinctively. When military power defined status, the Percys built the most formidable fortress in the north and filled it with soldiers paid for with ransom money. When political connection defined status, they backed usurpers, married strategically, and accepted pardons with the humility of men who had no intention of being humble. When cultural prestige defined status, they hired Italian architects and filled their halls with old masters. When tourism revenue defined status, they opened the gates to Harry Potter and built a poison garden. Each reinvention required a sacrifice. The border warriors sacrificed safety for ambition. The Tudor courtiers sacrificed independence for survival. The Victorian dukes sacrificed authenticity for beauty. The modern Percys sacrificed privacy for revenue. The common thread is not any single virtue or any consistent principle. It is a relentless willingness to become whatever the current century demands, even when the transformation means abandoning everything the previous century held sacred. The cost of that willingness is written in every stone of the castle. Hotspur's face, torn open by an arrow at Shrewsbury. The Earl of Northumberland's body, quartered and sent to rot on London Bridge. The 7th Earl, executed for treason under Elizabeth. The silent generations who held on through wars and taxes and the slow erosion of everything that had once made their power possible. The family crest, carved into towers paid for with the ransoms of broken men, still looks down on visitors who will never know what it cost to put it there. The oubliette is still beneath the courtyard. The cannonballs are still at the bottom of the well. The stone warriors are still on the battlements, medieval and Georgian, standing shoulder to shoulder, guarding a castle that has outlived every threat it was built to face. There is a temptation, standing in the courtyard at Alnwick, to see the castle as a relic, a beautiful, carefully maintained monument to a past that no longer matters. But that misreads what the Percys have always understood, what every generation of this family has learned in blood or in compromise. Power is not a relic. It is a practice. It is rebuilt every generation in whatever currency the era accepts. The Percys paid in blood. They paid in treason. They paid in marble. They pay now in admission tickets and gift shop revenue. The medium changes. The compulsion does not. The real magic of Alnwick Castle is not the wands or the broomsticks. It is not the Harry Potter tours or the poison garden or the grand cascade. It is the fact that a family built for war found a way to outlast peace. That a fortress designed to kill found a way to welcome 600,000 visitors a year. That the most rebellious bloodline in English history survived not by winning every fight, but by knowing which fights to lose, which kings to defy, which kings to flatter, and which centuries to simply endure. 700 years, one castle, one name on the gate. The Percys are still there, and the castle, as it has always done, endures.